Under a blood-red moon that painted the sky with omens, Eleanor Grace discovered that blood can be both chain and freedom, while the hot wind of Tahlequah carried with it the echo of a decision that would forever change the destiny of two worlds. On that night in 1878, when her father spoke the words that condemned her to exile, Eleanor didn't yet know she was about to embark on the most important journey of her life. The suffocating heat of July seemed to press against the wooden walls of the Crane house like an invisible weight, while Marshall stared at the documents scattered across the oak table. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted yet another demand letter, the words dancing before his tired eyes. Immediate payment required, and legal action imminent, repeated like a mantra of doom. Eleanor watched him from the kitchen doorway, her blonde hair pulled back in a braid that fell over her shoulder, her hands still damp from the water she'd used to wash the dinner dishes. At 22, she carried in her delicate face the traces of a beauty that had never quite managed to bloom fully, as if something inside her had remained waiting for a moment that never came. "Dad?" Her voice was barely a whisper in the oppressive silence of the evening. "Do you need help with the accounts?" Marshall looked up, and for an instant Eleanor saw in the faded blue of his eyes the man he'd once been, the one who used to carry her on his shoulders through the wheat fields, who told her stories of brave pioneers and promised lands. But that flash of tenderness quickly vanished, replaced by the hardness she now knew all too well. "No." The word came out dry, sharp as the wind that blew across the prairies. "There's nothing you can do." There never was anything you could do. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She knew what those words meant, the hidden weight behind every disappointed look her father had given her since 3 years ago. Dr. Henley had pronounced that medical verdict that changed everything. Infertile. A word that still echoed in her ears like a painful memory. The reminder of that childhood fall from a horse that had caused damage that only years later proved irreversible. The evening wind entered through the open window, carrying with it the sweet scent of prairie grass mixed with the red dust of Oklahoma soil. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply that air that tasted of home and freedom, not knowing that soon that scent would become just a memory. "I've made a decision," Marshall said suddenly, rising from his chair with the abrupt movement that made Eleanor jump. "A decision that will solve all our problems." The tone of his voice froze the blood in Eleanor's veins. There was something final in those words, something that spoke of roads with no return and sealed destinies. She slowly approached the table, her bare feet making barely any sound on the worn wooden floor. "What kind of decision, Dad?" Marshall didn't answer right away. Instead, he approached the window and looked toward the horizon, where the last lights of sunset painted the sky blood red. When he turned back to her, Eleanor saw in his eyes something she'd never seen before. A cold determination mixed with something that dangerously resembled relief. "Tomorrow you'll leave on a journey," he finally said. "A journey that will change your life." Dawn came too soon, painting the sky a pale pink that seemed almost mocking in its sweetness. Eleanor hadn't slept. She'd spent the night sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands clutched around a small silver cross that her mother had left her before dying. It was the only valuable object she owned, the only tangible link to the love she'd known in the early years of her life. The sound of hooves on the beaten ground made her jump. Through the window, she saw her father walking alongside 2 men on horseback. One was white, with gray mustache and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his eyes. The other had dark skin and black hair gathered in braids that fell over his shoulders. He wore a leather shirt decorated with colored beads that gleamed in the morning light. Eleanor went down the stairs with her heart beating hard, her bare feet slipping on the wooden steps worn by time. When she stepped onto the porch, the hot wind tousled her hair, carrying with it the smell of dust and horse sweat. "Eleanor," Marshall said without looking her in the eyes, "these gentlemen are here for you." The man with the gray mustache removed his hat in a gesture of formal courtesy. "Miss Grace, I'm Thomas Mitchell, agent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I'm here to escort you to Chief Tahousen's Comanche tribe, as established in the agreement reached with your father." The words hit Eleanor like punches to the chest. Agreement. Her father had sold her like livestock at market. She looked at Marshall, searching his eyes for some trace of the man who'd raised her, but found only emptiness. "Dad." Her voice was barely a broken whisper. "Dad, what have you done?" "I've done what I had to do to save this family," he replied with a hardness that hurt more than the words themselves. "Chief Tohausen needs a white wife to seal a peace treaty. In exchange, we'll receive land and protection. It's a profitable deal for everyone." The native man, who until that moment had remained silent, spoke with a deep voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I am Ayana, counselor to Tohausen. My chief sent me to escort the white woman to our land. We'll leave when the sun is high." Eleanor felt her knees give way. She gripped the porch railing, the silver cross pressing against her chest like a desperate talisman. The world around her seemed to spin, the men's voices becoming an indistinct buzz while she struggled to breathe. "You'll have an hour to prepare your personal effects," Mitchell said, consulting a golden pocket watch. "Bring only the essentials. Your new life awaits you." New life. The words echoed in Eleanor's mind like a death sentence. She looked at her father's face one last time, hoping to see even just a trace of remorse, a crack in his determination. But Marshall had already turned his back and was going back into the house, leaving her alone with the two strangers and the weight of a destiny she hadn't chosen. The wind blew stronger, raising whirlwinds of red dust that danced around them like restless spirits. Eleanor clutched the cross until she felt the cold metal imprinting itself in her palm. And for the first time in her life, she prayed not for salvation, but for the strength to survive what awaited her. The sun was high when they left Tahlequah, and Eleanor never looked back. Sitting rigidly in the saddle of a bay horse that Ayana had chosen for its docility, she held tight a small canvas bag that contained all that remained of her previous life: 2 dresses, a spare pair of shoes, a prayer book that had belonged to her mother, and the silver cross that now hung hidden under her blouse. The Oklahoma landscape stretched before them like a golden sea of tall grass swaying in the wind. Mitchell rode ahead, his hat pulled down over his eyes to protect himself from the merciless sun, while Ayana maintained a respectful but watchful distance beside Eleanor. The silence that enveloped them was broken only by the hypnotic rhythm of hooves on the beaten earth and the incessant whisper of wind through the grass. How long will the journey take?" Eleanor asked after hours of silence, her voice hoarse from thirst and suppressed emotion. Ayana looked at her with dark eyes as deep as water wells. 2 days and 2 nights. We'll stop when Father Sun hides behind the earth." It was the first time anyone had spoken to her with that strange poetic cadence, where each word seemed to carry a deeper meaning than the apparent one. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her own voice to respond. As they advanced, the landscape began to change subtly. The trees thinned out, replaced by infinite stretches of prairie dotted here and there with low bushes and wildflowers in vivid colors. The wind carried new scents: wild sage, red earth, and something wilder that Eleanor couldn't identify. "That's where our land begins," Ayana said, pointing to a spot on the horizon where the prairie seemed to merge with the sky. "Here the spirits of our ancestors walk free with the wind." Eleanor followed his gaze, and for a strange moment she felt something move in her chest. Not fear, but a sort of curiosity mixed with respect. There was something majestic in that boundless vastness, something that spoke of freedom in a way she'd never experienced in her restricted life in Tahlequah. What should I expect?" she finally asked, the question that had been tormenting her for hours. Ayana slowed his horse slightly to ride closer to her. "Tohausen is a just man. He won't hurt you, but our people—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Our people have suffered much because of the pale faces. It will take time for them to accept you. And if they never do?" The wind grew stronger, almost as if wanting to carry away that question loaded with fear. Ayana remained silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent toward evening. "Every plant needs the right soil to grow," he finally said. "Maybe you're just going toward the land that was always meant for you." Those words hung in the air as they rode toward sunset. Eleanor felt the silver cross press against her chest with every movement of the horse, and for the first time since she'd left home, a small spark of something that wasn't despair began to shine in the darkness of her thoughts. Maybe, just maybe, she was going toward not an end, but a beginning. The village appeared suddenly beyond a low ridge, as if it had emerged from the earth itself. Eleanor held her breath, seeing the conical leather teepees arranged in concentric circles. their poles silhouetted against the golden sunset sky like fingers stretched toward the spirits. Threads of blue smoke rose lazily from the evening fires, bringing into the air the smell of burning wood and roasted meat. But what struck her most was the silence that fell when they entered the village. The children playing among the tents stopped, their eyes wide at seeing the white woman on horseback. The women preparing dinner looked up from their fires, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of gazes studying her with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. "Tohausen awaits us," Ayana said in a low voice, pointing to a teepee larger than the others at the center of the village, decorated with paintings of galloping horses and symbols that Eleanor couldn't decipher. They dismounted from their horses, and Eleanor felt her legs tremble from the fatigue of the journey and emotion. The evening wind tousled her hair, carrying with it whispered voices in a language she didn't understand, but whose tone left no doubt. She wasn't welcome. A tall and imposing man emerged from the central teepee. Tohausen wasn't what Eleanor had expected. He was perhaps 30 years old, with long black hair that fell freely over his shoulders, and a face with noble features, marked by a thin scar that crossed his left cheek. His eyes, dark as a moonless night, studied her with an intensity that made her blush. "Welcome to our land," he said in slow but correct English, his deep voice resonating in the calm evening. "I am Tohausen, chief of this people." Eleanor lowered her gaze, not knowing how to behave. In Tahlequah, they would have taught her to curtsy, but here, in this so different world, every gesture seemed wrong. I am Eleanor Grace," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "Eleanor," he repeated, and her name on Tohausen's tongue sounded different, more musical. "Name that means light, good. This land needs light." A woman stepped forward from the crowd that had gathered around them. She was younger than Eleanor, with long braided hair decorated with feathers and beads, and in her eyes she had something fierce that made Eleanor instinctively step back. "Nayali," Tohausen said with a tone of warning, but the woman didn't seem to hear him. "This is the woman the spirits have cursed?" Nayali asked with a cutting voice, her eyes burning with contempt as she stared at Eleanor. "The one who cannot bear fruit to the earth? Why do you bring misfortune to our village, Tohausen?" The silence that followed was so deep that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat. She felt the silver cross press against her chest, small and cold against her sun-reddened skin, and wondered if her mother's blessing could protect her even here, in this world that seemed to speak a different language even with the spirits. "Nayali," Tohausen said with a firm voice, "this woman is under my protection. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." But Eleanor saw in the faces around her that the chief's words weren't enough to erase the fear that was already spreading like black smoke among her new people. The first days in the village passed like a confused dream, where Eleanor moved like a shadow among people who looked at her but pretended not to see her. Tohausen had assigned her a small teepee at the edges of the village, close enough to his to be under his protection, but far enough not to offend those who considered her presence a desecration. Eleanor woke every morning to the song of birds and the distant sound of voices preparing for the new day. Through the leather walls of her tent filtered the golden light of dawn, and she remained motionless on the bed of furs that had been prepared for her, clutching the silver cross between her fingers, and wondering if this was all life had reserved for her, to be a stranger forever. The morning wind always carried the same smells: wood smoke, tanned leather, wild herbs, but also something more subtle that she was beginning to recognize as the scent of freedom itself. Here there were no wooden walls imprisoning her, no paternal looks of disapproval following her into every room. There was only the infinite sky and the earth that extended beyond every horizon. Tohausen came to visit her every evening, bringing food and kind words. He asked nothing of her, demanded nothing. He sat beside the fire she'd learned to light and told her stories of his people, of the spirits that inhabited every element of nature, of the seasons that danced eternally between birth and death. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked him one evening, while watching the stars beginning to dot the purple sky. "Your people hate me." Tohausen remained silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the night wind. "My father taught me that the earth belongs to no one, but everyone belongs to the earth. You are here. This means the earth has called you. Nayali says I bring misfortune." "Nayali is afraid," he replied simply, Fear makes you see monsters where there are only shadows. Eleanor began to cautiously explore the surroundings of the village. Early in the morning, when most people were still asleep, she walked along the watercourse that flowed beside the tents, watching how the sunlight made the surface shine like liquid gold. It was there that she met Ayanna one morning, while he was gathering medicinal herbs along the bank. "The white woman wakes early," he said, without looking up from the plants he was examining. "I can't sleep," Eleanor admitted, sitting on a flat rock near the water. "Everything here is so different." "Different doesn't mean wrong," Ayanna replied, finally raising his eyes to look at her. "Look at this herb." He showed her a plant with silvery leaves. "In Tahlequah, you would call it a weed. Here we call it medicine for the broken heart." Eleanor gently touched the leaves, surprised by their softness. "And does it work?" Ayanna smiled, and it was the first time Eleanor saw true kindness in someone's eyes in the village. The broken heart can always heal. It just needs the right time and the right care. The wind blew stronger, carrying with it the sweet scent of the herb, and something Eleanor was beginning to recognize as hope. The weeks flowed like the river water, and Eleanor slowly began to find her place in that world that had once seemed so foreign to her. Ayanna became her silent teacher, teaching her to recognize medicinal plants, to read the signs that the wind brought from distant prairies, to move on the earth without disturbing the spirits that lived there. "Your hands are good," Ayanna said one morning, watching Eleanor prepare an herbal compress for an injured horse. "They know how to give healing." Eleanor felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. In Tahlequah, her hands had been considered useless, incapable of creating the life her father desired. Here she discovered they could be instruments of care and understanding. Tohausen began taking her with him during morning rides. He taught her to ride in the way of his people, not with the rigidity she'd learned in her previous life, but as if horse and rider were a single creature dancing with the wind. Eleanor discovered a freedom she'd never known, galloping across infinite stretches of golden grass, her loose hair flying behind her like flags of joy. "You were born for this," Tohausen told her one evening, as they returned to the village with the sun painting the sky orange and red. "I see it in the way the earth responds to you." But not everyone in the village saw her transformation with the same eyes. Nayali continued to watch her with growing suspicion, and Eleanor often felt the weight of her dark eyes following her every time she moved among the tents. The older women whispered among themselves when she passed, and even though she didn't understand their words, the tone was clear. It was during one of those mornings heavy with tension that the event happened that would change everything. Eleanor was walking toward the river when she heard a sharp cry coming from the direction of the village. She ran toward the sound and found a small group of people gathered around a girl of perhaps 6 years old, who lay motionless on the ground, her face pale and her breathing labored. "She was bitten by a snake," one of the women said in broken English, her voice full of panic. Nayali went to look for the healer, but he's far away. "The child will die." Eleanor knelt beside the little girl, her heart beating hard while her hands gently explored the child's body. She found the 2 small holes on the ankle, already swollen and purplish. Without thinking, she began to do what she'd seen Dr. Henley do in Tahlequah. She sucked the poison from the wound, spitting it away, then used her scarf to make a tourniquet above the wound. "Ayanna," she called, and when the man came running, she already had the silver cross in her hand. "I need the herbs you showed me, the ones to purify the blood." They worked together for hours, Eleanor applying what she'd learned in her previous life and what she'd discovered here, while Ayanna prepared the traditional medicines. When the child finally opened her eyes and smiled weakly, an amazed silence fell over the group of spectators that had gathered. "How did you do it?" whispered the child's mother, her eyes full of tears of gratitude. Eleanor looked at the silver cross in her hands, then at the child's face, who was now breathing normally. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just knew what to do." The evening wind carried away their words, but Eleanor felt that something had changed forever in the hearts of those who had witnessed the miracle. After the rescue of little Ayanna, as they'd named her in honor of the man who had helped Eleanor, something in the village began to change. It wasn't a sudden change, but subtle, like the changing of seasons. Some women began to greet her with a nod when they met her, and the children no longer ran away when she approached. Eleanor woke every morning with a growing sense of belonging that surprised her. The dawn wind no longer brought just the scent of freedom, but also that of home. When she stepped out of her teepee and saw the infinite horizon of the prairie, she no longer felt that weight on her chest that had accompanied her throughout her life in Tahlequah. Tohausen began spending more time with her, not just during rides or evening visits, but sharing meals and moments of silence that Eleanor discovered could be more eloquent than words. There was something in his eyes when he looked at her that made her heart beat faster, something that went beyond protection or kindness. One evening, while they were sitting beside the river that flowed at the edges of the village, Tohausen asked her a question that caught her by surprise. "Are you happy here, Eleanor?" She looked at the water that reflected the first stars of the night, the silver cross that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. "I don't know if I still know what it means to be happy," she replied honestly. "But for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong to something. My people are beginning to see you as I see you," he said, his deep voice vibrating with an emotion Eleanor couldn't decipher. As a strong woman capable of bringing healing, Nayeli doesn't think so. Nayeli is afraid of losing her power. But true power can't be lost because it comes from the heart, not from fear. If you're listening to this story and it's gripping you as much as it's gripping me in telling it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this incredible transformation. Eleanor is about to discover something that will change everything. The silence that followed was charged with something unspoken, and Eleanor felt a strange warmth spread from her chest to her fingertips. When Tohausen turned to look at her, their eyes met, and she saw in his a tenderness that made her tremble. "Eleanor," he whispered, and her name on his tongue sounded like a prayer. "You're not here just for an agreement. You know that, right?" She nodded, not trusting her own voice. She knew that what was growing between them was stronger than any contract signed by her father, deeper than any political strategy. It was something that grew like prairie grass, slowly but with roots that extended to the heart of the earth. That night, Eleanor stayed awake for a long time, listening to the wind whispering among the tents and the distant sound of drums accompanying a sacred ceremony. She felt something moving inside her, something that wasn't just emotion but a deeper transformation, as if her body itself was beginning to respond to the new life she had embraced. She didn't yet know that this sensation was the beginning of a miracle that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. The first signs came with the dawn of a September morning, when Eleanor woke with a feeling of nausea that turned her stomach. She initially thought it was something she'd eaten the night before, maybe the wild roots that Ayana had taught her to prepare. But when the malaise returned for 3 consecutive mornings, accompanied by a strange sensitivity to smells that she'd previously enjoyed, she began to suspect something impossible. The morning wind that entered her teepee carried the familiar smell of wood smoke, but now it seemed so intense as to be nauseating. She got up with slow movements, holding the silver cross tight in her fist, and went outside, hoping the cool breeze could alleviate the sense of dizziness that was accompanying her. "Are you sick?" Tohausen's voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him approach, absorbed as she was in trying to calm her rebellious stomach. "Just a bit tired," she lied, not wanting to worry him with something that was probably a product of her imagination. But Tohausen knew her too well by now. His dark eyes studied her with that intensity that always made her blush, and Eleanor saw he wasn't convinced by her answer. "Nayeli wants to speak with you," he finally said, and the tone of his voice froze the blood in Eleanor's veins. Nayeli was the oldest healer in the village, a woman with hair white as snow and eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. Eleanor had met her only once during a healing ceremony, and had felt the weight of a gaze that seemed to read directly into her soul. They found her sitting in front of her teepee, her wrinkled hands working with intensely scented herbs. When Eleanor approached, the old healer looked up and smiled with an expression that mixed wisdom and mystery. "Sit down, daughter of light," she said with a rough but gentle voice. "Your handmaids have whispered secrets to me in the wind." Eleanor sat with trembling legs, not understanding what she meant. Nayeli took her hands in hers, and Eleanor felt a strange warmth spread from the old woman's fingers to hers. "Your body is changing," Nayeli said after a long moment of silence. "You feel nausea in the morning? Do smells seem stronger to you?" Eleanor nodded, her heart beginning to beat faster. "And your woman's blood? When did it last come?" The question hit her like lightning. Eleanor mentally counted the days and realized with growing amazement that more than 6 weeks had passed since the last time. With the excitement and changes of her new life, she hadn't paid attention. It's not possible," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The doctor in Tahlequah said I can't." "The pale faces doctors see only with their eyes," Nayeli said, with a smile that lit up her entire wrinkled face. "But the earth has its ways of healing what seemed broken. You carry a new life, daughter of light. A child grows in your womb." The world around Eleanor stopped. The wind stopped blowing. The birds stopped singing. Even her heart seemed to stop for an infinite instant. Then everything started flowing again in a wave of emotion so intense she couldn't breathe. Is it true?" she asked in a thread of voice, her hands instinctively moving to her still flat belly. "True as the sun that rises every morning," Nayeli replied. "The earth has accepted you, and now it gives you its greatest miracle." The news of Eleanor's pregnancy spread through the village like fire in dry grass. By sunset, everyone knew that the white woman whom doctors had declared sterile now carried new life in her womb. The reactions were as diverse as the people who populated the village. Some saw in the pregnancy a sign of blessing from the spirits, others an omen of even more terrible misfortune. Eleanor spent that night sitting in front of her fire, her hands placed protectively on her belly, while the night wind carried fragments of conversations from the other teepees. She could distinguish the voices, some full of wonder, others charged with worry. But the one that troubled her most was Nayali's silence, who hadn't said a word since she'd learned the news. Tohausen arrived when the moon was high in the sky, his face illuminated by an expression Eleanor had never seen before. There was joy in his eyes, but also something deeper, a pride mixed with tenderness that made her tremble. "Is it true?" he asked, kneeling beside her. His voice was barely a whisper, as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell. Eleanor nodded, the silver cross gleaming in the firelight as she clutched it to her chest. "Nayeli says it's a miracle of the earth, that my body has learned to heal." Tohausen took her hands, and Eleanor felt in his grip a silent promise. "This child will be the bridge between our two worlds," he said with a deep voice, a symbol of peace and hope. But even as he spoke those words, both knew that not everyone would see the pregnancy in that light. The next morning, Eleanor was awakened by sharp voices coming from the center of the village. When she stepped out of her teepee, she saw a group of elders gathered around Nayeli, who was gesticulating animatedly while speaking in their language. Even though she didn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable, accusatory, full of anger and fear. Ayana approached her with a worried expression. "Nayeli says your pregnancy is a deception by evil spirits," he explained in a low voice. "She claims that a sterile woman who suddenly conceives brings curse to the land and crops." As if to confirm his words, Eleanor noticed for the first time that the corn plants at the edges of the village seemed withered. Their leaves yellowed despite it still being September. The squashes growing near the river showed signs of disease, and even the prairie grass seemed less lush than usual. "It's the drought's fault," Eleanor said, but she too began to feel a creeping doubt. There were too many coincidences to ignore. "Maybe," Ayana replied, "but Nayeli has influence over the elders. She's asking for a tribal council to be called to decide your fate." The wind grew stronger, carrying with it dust and dry leaves that swirled around them like ominous portents. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine and instinctively brought her hands to her belly where new life was growing, unaware of the storm gathering around her. That evening, when Tohausen came to visit her, his face was grave. "The council will meet in 3 days," he told her. "You'll have to defend yourself before the tribe." Eleanor looked at the fire dancing in the night wind, the flames seeming to whisper ancient secrets. "And if they decide I have to leave, then I'll come with you," he replied without hesitation. And in those words, Eleanor heard all the love and determination of a man willing to sacrifice everything to protect her. But both knew it might not be enough. The day of the tribal council arrived with a gray sky threatening storms. The wind blew hard from the prairie, carrying with it smells of rain and dust that foreshadowed imminent changes. Eleanor woke at dawn with her stomach twisting from morning sickness and from the anxiety that gnawed at her chest like a hungry animal. She dressed carefully, choosing the simplest dress she owned, and braided her hair in the way she'd learned by watching the village women. Her mother's silver cross rested hidden under the fabric, a silent talisman against the uncertainty that awaited her. The council gathered in the center of the village, where a large fire had been lit surrounded by stones arranged in a circle. The elders took their places on leather mats, their faces marked by years and wisdom, but also by the hardness of those who had seen too much suffering. Nayeli sat to their right, her eyes shining with anticipated triumph. Tohausen stood first, his imposing presence dominating the meeting even in silence. "We are here to discuss the fate of Eleanor, who lives among us as my promised bride," he began with a firm voice. "She has brought healing to our sick and has learned our traditions with respect. She has also brought curse," Nayeli shouted, jumping to her feet with an abrupt movement. "Look at our crops. The corn withers, the squashes rot, the earth itself weeps for her presence. And now she claims to bear a child when the spirits declared her sterile." A murmur of voices rose from the circle, some in agreement with Nayeli, others in dissent. Eleanor felt her heart beating so hard she feared everyone could hear it. One of the oldest elders, a man named Takoda, spoke with a tremulous but authoritative voice. "Sterility is a mark of the spirits. If a sterile woman conceives, it's because dark forces interfere with the natural order, or because the earth has chosen to heal her," intervened Nayeli, the elder healer, with a firm voice. "I have seen the miracle of life born where it seemed impossible. Not all changes are curses." Eleanor looked at the faces around the fire, seeking understanding in those eyes that judged her. Some showed curiosity, others distrust, many simply fear of the unknown she represented. "Let her speak," Tohausen said suddenly. "She has the right to defend herself with her words." The silence that fell was so deep that Eleanor could hear the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the grass. She rose slowly, her legs trembling under the weight of all those gazes. For a moment her mind went completely blank. Then, unexpectedly, she heard her mother's voice whispering in the wind. The same words she used to tell her when she was a child and afraid of the dark. "The brightest light is born from the darkest nights." "I didn't come here to bring curse," Eleanor began, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I arrived as a broken woman, abandoned by my own blood. But here I learned that being broken doesn't mean being useless. I learned that the earth has the power to heal what seems lost forever." She placed her hands on her belly, where new life was growing. "If my child is a bridge between our worlds, then it's a gift we must accept together. If it's a challenge, then it's a challenge we must face together. But I won't allow fear to decide my child's fate." The wind grew stronger, and in the distance the first thunder of the approaching storm began to be heard. Before the elders could deliberate, the sound of galloping hooves interrupted the council. From the edge of the village appeared a group of riders, and Eleanor's heart froze when she recognized the figure leading the group. Marshal Crane, her father, with the same hard face and the same cold eyes that had condemned her months before. "This meeting is over," Marshal declared, dismounting from his horse with abrupt movements, completely ignoring the protocols of respect he should have observed in Comanche territory. "I've come to take back my daughter." Tohausen rose slowly, every muscle in his body tense like a bowstring. "You have no more rights over her, white man. You sold her like livestock." "A father's rights are never completely sold," Marshal replied with a sneer Eleanor knew too well. "Especially when that daughter carries in her womb a child that could be worth more than gold." The silence that followed was charged with danger. Eleanor felt the blood freeze in her veins as she fully understood what those words meant. Her father hadn't come to take her home. He'd come to claim the child growing in her womb, seeing in that new life an opportunity for redemption from his debts. "How did you find out about the pregnancy?" Eleanor asked, finding the courage to speak despite the fear gripping her throat. "News travels fast along the trading routes," Marshall replied. "A half-breed child with Comanche blood could open many doors in relations with the tribes. It could be very valuable to the right men." Nayeli stepped forward, and Eleanor saw in her eyes something she'd never noticed before. It wasn't just fear or superstition, but a deep understanding of the danger Marshall represented. "This man speaks of selling children like selling horses," she said with a cutting voice. "Is this the world you come from, white woman?" Eleanor felt crushed between two worlds that suddenly both seemed hostile to her. On one side was the father who had betrayed her and now wanted to exploit her child. On the other, a community that still doubted her belonging. It was then that Tohausen did something no one expected. He approached Marshal Crane, stopping a few steps from him, and spoke with a voice so low and dangerous that everyone had to be silent to hear. "If you think you're taking Eleanor from my village, you'll have to kill me first," he said with lethal calm. "And if you think you're selling the child she carries, you'll have to kill every warrior of this tribe." Marshall burst into bitter laughter. "You threaten me? I have legal documents that establish that my daughter belongs to me, and the child she carries belongs to my family." "Your documents are worth nothing on this land," Tohausen replied. "Here, only courage and honor count. Two things you don't possess." The wind suddenly became icy, bringing the first drops of rain from the approaching storm. Eleanor felt the silver cross press against her chest, and in that moment, she understood it was time to choose once and for all between the world that had rejected her and the one that had welcomed her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said with a firm voice, standing up and looking straight into her father's eyes. "This is my place now. This is my family." Marshall looked at her with an incredulous expression, then with growing anger. "You're my daughter. You can't—" "I was your daughter," Eleanor interrupted him, and in her voice there was a strength she'd never possessed before. "Until you sold me to save yourself. Now I'm a free woman, and this child will grow free with me." The storm broke at that moment, as if nature itself was applauding her declaration of independence. Rain began to fall heavily, and everyone ran to seek shelter. But Eleanor remained motionless under the water that soaked her, finally feeling washed clean of all the pain of the past. The storm raged all night with a violence that seemed to want to wash away the old world to make room for the new. Eleanor stayed awake in her teepee, listening to the thunder rumbling like war drums and the lightning illuminating the tent walls like will-o'-the-wisps. The wind howled among the village tents, carrying with it the intense scent of wet earth and rebirth. Marshal Crane and his men had sought shelter at the edges of the village, but no one had offered them hospitality. In the morning, when the storm subsided, leaving behind a washed and sparkling world, Eleanor stepped out of her teepee to find her father waiting for her, his face marked by a sleepless night and suppressed rage. "This isn't over, Eleanor," he told her with a hoarse voice. "I'll come back with stronger documents, with armed men if necessary. That child belongs to the Crane family." But as he spoke those words, something in his eyes went out. Eleanor saw him for what he truly was, a man defeated by life, who had lost everything, including his dignity, and who was now desperately clinging to a last illusion of control. "Goodbye, Dad," Eleanor said with infinite sadness but no longer any fear. "I hope someday you can find the peace you're looking for." Marshall mounted his horse without adding anything else, and Eleanor watched him ride away toward the horizon until he became a black dot that disappeared in the vastness of the prairie. She knew with a certainty that came from deep in her heart that she would never see him again. When she turned, she found the entire village gathered in silence behind her. Nayali stepped forward, and Eleanor prepared mentally for yet another confrontation. But instead of the words of condemnation she expected, she saw in the woman's eyes something completely different. Respect. "You've shown more courage than many warriors," Nayali said with a firm voice. "You rejected your own blood to protect the child you carry. This is the heart of a true mother, of a true woman of our tribe." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. Nayali's recognition meant more than any official proclamation. It meant she had finally been accepted not as a tolerated stranger, but as one of them. The elders consulted briefly, then Dakota spoke for everyone. "The council decides that Eleanor Grace is one of us. The child she carries is a blessing, not a curse. Anyone who threatens her or her child will have to answer to the entire tribe." Tohausen approached Eleanor, and when he took her hands, she felt in that grip all the love and promise of a shared future. "Do you want to become my wife, according to our traditions?" he asked with a voice sweet but firm. Eleanor looked at the silver cross gleaming in the morning sun, then at the infinite horizon stretching before them, finally at the face of the man who had welcomed her when the whole world had rejected her. "Yes," she whispered, and that word contained all the courage she'd had to find to get to that moment. The prairie wind carried away her answer, spreading it in every direction like a promise of love that would last forever. And as the sun rose high in the blue sky, Eleanor felt for the first time in her life that she was exactly where she needed to be, with her roots finally planted in the right soil to bloom. Months passed like seasons in a happy dream. Eleanor flourished with the progress of her pregnancy, her body gently rounding as she learned the ancient rhythms of tribal life. The village women who had once looked at her with suspicion now surrounded her with care and advice, sharing with her secrets passed down from mother to daughter for generations. Nayeli became her most precious guide, teaching her the herbs that would make childbirth easier, the songs that would call good spirits to protect the child, the traditions that would welcome new life into the world. Eleanor absorbed every teaching like thirsty earth drinks rain, and every day she felt more rooted in what she now called home without hesitation. Tohausen built a larger teepee for her, decorated with symbols of protection and fertility, that he himself painted with colors derived from the colored earth of the prairie. On winter evenings, when the icy wind blew from the northern plains, they sat by the fire, and he told her the legends of his people, preparing her to pass down those stories to the child who would come. "He'll be strong like his father and wise like his mother," Tohausen would say, gently caressing Eleanor's rounded belly. "And he'll have the privilege of belonging to two worlds." But it was on a March night, when a red moon rose on the horizon, the same moon that had witnessed her departure from Tahlequah, that fate decided to complete its last, magnificent turn of the wheel. Eleanor woke in the heart of the night with a contraction that tore a cry of surprise from her. The pain was different from anything she'd ever felt, primitive and powerful, like the force of nature itself. Outside, the spring wind carried the smell of earth awakening, and the first grasses sprouting from the melting snow. "Tohausen," she whispered, gently shaking her husband who slept beside her. "It's time." What followed was like an ancestral dance, orchestrated by the village women. Nayeli arrived first, followed by the other healers, each with her precise role in the miracle about to take place. They lit special fires with sacred woods, prepared herbal decoctions that filled the air with intense fragrances, intoned songs that seemed to come from the earth itself. Eleanor fought for hours while outside the spring storm raged with a fury that seemed to echo her labor. Lightning illuminated the red sky, thunder rumbled like celebration drums, and the wind howled, carrying away every cry of pain and transforming it into prayer. She held tight her mother's silver cross, feeling through the cold metal a connection that crossed life and death, past and future. "Help me, Mom," she whispered between contractions. "Help me bring this new life into the world." And when finally, with a last cry that mixed with the thunder tearing through the night, the child slipped into Nayeli's expert hands, Eleanor felt as if the whole world stopped for a moment of perfect silence. Then a strong and healthy cry filled the teepee, and Eleanor burst into tears of joy and relief while Nayeli raised the child toward the red moon shining through the top opening of the tent. "A boy," the healer announced with a voice full of wonder, "strong and perfect with the lungs of a warrior." The dawn that followed the birth of the little one was the most beautiful Eleanor had ever seen. The sky was painted pink and gold while the morning wind carried the sweet scent of spring flowers blooming in the prairie. The storm had washed the air, leaving everything so clear and clean that every detail seemed painted by divine hands. Eleanor held the child against her chest, the perfect little face sleeping peacefully after the long battle to come into the world. Tohausen sat beside her, his eyes shining with a tenderness he'd never shown before, while with one finger, he gently caressed the little closed fist of his son. "What shall we call him?" Eleanor asked, her voice still hoarse from the fatigue of childbirth. "Ayanua," Tohausen replied after a moment of reflection. "It means he who swims against the current, because this child was born defying everything the world believed impossible." Eleanor smiled, knowing she couldn't have imagined a more perfect name. Ayanua had truly swum against the current to come into the world, overcoming medical diagnoses, tribal superstitions, and even his grandfather's attempt to claim him as property. Nayeli entered the teepee carrying a bowl of hot broth and a smile that lit up her entire wrinkled face. "The village wants to celebrate," she announced. "Everyone wants to see the miracle with their own eyes." And it truly was a miracle they saw. Because when Eleanor stepped out of the teepee with Ayanua in her arms, the sun illuminated a completely transformed world. The plants that had withered during the months of tension now showed signs of new life. Green shoots sprouted from corn that had seemed dead, Squashes began to form new fruits, and even the prairie grass seemed greener and more lush. "The spirits have spoken," Dakota said with a voice full of wonder. "The child hasn't brought curse, but blessing. The earth itself celebrates his birth." Nayali approached Eleanor with a solemn expression. "I ask forgiveness for my doubts," she said, and in her voice there was a sincerity that moved Eleanor to tears. "I hadn't understood that you weren't here to take something from our land, but to give it something precious." Eleanor looked at the face of the woman who had been her greatest opponent and was now offering her respect and friendship. "There's nothing to forgive," she replied gently. "Fear makes us see enemies where there could be allies." As the village gathered around them to celebrate the new life, Eleanor felt the silver cross pressed gently against her chest. For the last time, she touched it through the fabric, but now not as a talisman of protection, but as a bridge between past and future. Her mother had guided her this far, and now she could let her go knowing she had found her way. The prairie wind blew sweet through Eleanor's hair, carrying with it no longer the scent of loneliness but that of home. She looked at Tohausen, holding their son in his arms, then at the infinite horizon stretching before them, rich with promises and possibilities. She had left Tahlequah as a broken woman, convinced she had nothing to offer the world. Now she knew she had always been whole. She had just needed to find the right soil where to plant her roots and bloom. And as Ayanawa opened his little dark eyes to the world awaiting him for the first time, Eleanor understood that her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. If this story has touched your heart, like it touched mine in telling it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other stories of courage and transformation. Write in the comments where you're listening to this story from. I'm curious to know in which part of the world Eleanor's words have found a home in your heart.